Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. So firstly, let me give you an introduction here, okay? We're going to be talking about Thomas Aquinas' cogitative sense. And Mark Barker is actually writing a book about it. So it's one of the best people we could have here to talk about it. Now, I'm telling you, this is going to be very tough, okay? Because a lot has happened since Aquinas did his work. Okay, Aquinas is like in a genius class for me, because what he did was that he took Aristotle, okay, all of Aristotle, his corpus, every part of philosophy of his, and managed to integrate it into Christianity. I mean, it is a feat of tremendous proportions. But it's been a while, and a lot has happened since. And what we're trying to understand is something very simple. We're trying to understand what a human being is. That's it. Okay. But we have the idea of what a human being is has transformed so much since Aquinas wrote that there are so many layers and layers and layers of ideas about what a human being is that you hold that you may not even know of, but you take for granted. And in order to understand somebody like Aristotle, somebody like Aquinas, you kind of have to keep that aside for some time and actually hear, at least give a hearing to what Aquinas has to say about human beings. And then you can decide. You have a very powerful technology. It's very recent, but it's very, very powerful. And I strongly recommend it. You really need it, okay? I know some of you are not that high tech, but this was discovered about 5,000 years ago, okay? Pen and paper, it's extremely powerful. What it does, what the writing does, is that it allows you to take your thoughts, which are in here, and put it out here. So make detailed notes, keep track of what is it that you agree with, what is it that you have questions about. Try to understand what is being said about the human being. Formulate all of it. You will have a chance to ask all the questions that you have. But the only way you're going to be able to process this is to keep track of it externally. External memory, as we heard from Merlin Donald, external memory, or Julian Jaynes, external memory is very, very powerful and only way to process something like this. So I urge you to do that. Again, you have to understand it in your own terms. So please take everything in, give it a hearing, and then ask all the questions that you have. Okay. So with that, let me get started. Again, welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am honored to have Dr. Mark Barker here. He's writing a book on the cogitative sense of Thomas Aquinas, and he's going to be talking just about that today. So welcome, Mark.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful. So, tell me a little bit about yourself. You grew up in New York?
That's right. Yes.
Wonderful. I'm a New Yorker, so this is very close to my heart. How long did you spend in New York?
Until I went to college. So yeah, I wish we could all be up there together someplace, but this is second best.
Yes, I think all good people need to be in New York. I'm very biased, but so when did you get interested in Thomas Aquinas' work?
For about 20 years ago, I guess, give or take, maybe 25 years ago.
Okay, now tell me, what is the difference? If you want to give like a 30,000-foot view, how does Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle look at human beings, and how does modern psychology look at human beings? What's the difference?
So the terminology that I would use, or anybody would use, I guess, is so you have anthropology, but you have philosophical anthropology. So what you're talking about, or we're talking about, is philosophical anthropology. So we're familiar with, scientific anthropology, scientific used in the sense of, studying different cultures. And from Aristotle's point of view, which Thomas Aquinas shares, I usually just call him Thomas, Those culture is important. And we certainly don't want to deny the important role that culture plays, but there's this great split between Thomas and Aristotle and the moderns is regarding the idea of nature.
Mm-hmm.
So for Thomas and Aristotle, there's a human nature that endures, that's basically no matter where you are in the world right now, whether you're an Eskimo, whether you're in Kenya, whether you're in our society, cutting edge technology, or whether you're in the wilds of Amazonia where they don't even know maybe the technology exists, there's still a fundamental human nature that's what they would say is universal. And that's what we're interested in then is that. And so that's kind of the difference. I hate to be critical, but so early on, but unfortunately,
please feel free to be critical or praising of anybody or anything that you want. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I hate to be critical, but so we talk about modern science, and in some respect, so what does that mean, right? In some respect, modern is good, right? It's good that we have modern science. We have great progress and knowledge of the world around us. So as soon as you pick up Thomas, this is the kind of problem you might run into. Is for example, he says there's 4 elements, right? Fire, earth, air, and water. But then actually that's obsolete. So there's obsolete science in Thomas and in Aristotle, and really anyone before 1750, or even anyone before 1900, depending on what you're talking about, or 1920, or right? I mean, it keeps advancing. But so that's good. It's good that modern science has those discoveries. But the negative side about modernity is that it's also beholden to philosophies. So beginning with Galileo, Francis Bacon, Descartes, even before them, Montaigne, that deny the idea of a human nature. And so there's the kind of glory of modern science with all of its wonderful discoveries, but then there's the downside, the detriment, the negative of the modernity, which is that denial of one universal human nature that we all share. And so that would be maybe the fundamental difference. And you see that playing out itself out in our society on a daily basis. So that would be.
Let me just emphasize this point, because I think this is a huge point. I think you put it very crisply. It's nature and culture. So Aristotle and Aquinas say, pay attention to nature. That is fundamental. That is metaphysical. That's just what is. Whereas lot of modern thinking, most of the modern thinking about human beings does not give that. Can give that its due. And in a sense, culture, I mean, they would also agree that there is culture, but they would say culture sits on the top of nature. You can't really understand culture without understanding nature. So there is a hierarchy of relationship between that. Whereas the moderns seem to kind of just look at culture and kind of look at almost, I mean, to put it in an extreme way, by looking at culture as a primary and denying that there is a nature, they would say that human being is infinitely malleable, because it's like you can make it whatever it wants to be, and whatever you can be, whatever you feel like.
Right, and so that's where you get into, so y'all, I'm speaking like a Southerner now. Those of you who are involved in the Center for Digital Research, right, you're interested in the impact of technology on this question of human nature, and right, claims about transhumanism, that we can somehow transcend our humanity. I could live on in a computer. I could have an interface from my brain to a computer. And so exactly, because there is no human nature, we're just kind of machines that are, like you said, infinitely malleable. And but in contrast to that view, I think, just in putting the Aristotelian view in my own words, would be that, or actually, I'll use Thomas here. So sometimes Thomas just makes very passing comments that are extremely brilliant, because, as you said, he is kind of that genius class. And he, just a passing comment somewhere in one of his works, actually I think the De Potentia, the book on the power of God, but he's not talking about the power of God there. But what he says is that, he says, the only thing, he says, the most powerful thing, well, he does, okay. He says the most powerful thing is God, God's omnipotence. But he says, in creation, the most powerful thing is nature. And that's a pretty striking statement. He says there's nothing more powerful than nature. And really modern science or contemporary science, is aware of that. I mean, there are these natural laws that are just apply, right? Like you can't get around the law of gravity. You can't get around the gravitational field. If you're on the Earth's surface, it applies to you. And you could think that I could tell myself, well, it doesn't apply to me, but when I jump, I still come down. Like my reality, it's all the other thing about Aristotle's realism, right? That reality is prior to whatever goes on in my mind. And the truth is conformity of my mind with reality. So I'm either in conformity with it or in disconformity. So if I deny that gravity exists, I can jump up, but it still applies to me. It's just there. There's nothing I can do about that. Like you said, the metaphysical, question or the metaphysical issue of just what exists. So that's, yeah. So that anyway.
Okay.
The realism is a big part of the picture as well. Yeah.
Okay. So let's do this. Let's just dive into Aristotle and Aquinas and paint out what they think is human nature.
Right.
So how would you like
right. So that's where you get into. So unless you've read Thomas, you're not going to know about the cogitative. Now maybe a qualifier there is there's this thing called the Thomistic Institute. So fortunately, people are trying to bring Thomas back kind of into people's awareness, because there's really a desperate need in our culture for realist philosophy and Aristotelian anthropology or Aristotelian Thomist anthropology. So the Thomistic Institute, they're putting out all these videos, and they have a video about, Thomas on the soul, and there's the cogitative power. So they're not going to leave it out, and they'll mention it in 30 seconds just so people, that they're not going to leave that out, which is, I applaud them for that, because some Thomists did leave it out. Basically the Thomistic revival was in the mid 1800s, and so some Thomists left out the cogitative power. They said, "Oh, that's obsolete." Mm-hmm. So that's the question. But so the way that Thomas is going to understand human nature, that is going to be in terms of powers, right? So we have, well, first of all, that we're a soul-body composite. So, right, Plato had said, well, basically the pre-Socratics, the people, the first philosophers in the Western world, in ancient Greece, by and large were materialists. So before Plato, you could call them the pre-Platonics if you want, but traditionally they're called pre-Socratics. So some of them, Democritus, for example, was a materialist. Most of them were materialists. So for them, I'm just matter. And Democritus talked about atoms. So for Democritus, as many of my students are surprised to hear that, but atomism dates back to 450 BC. So Democritus says I'm just a bunch of atoms, and then he says I have a soul, but he says the soul is just fire atoms. So when he says he has a soul, nowadays we wouldn't even use that word. We'd say, oh, my consciousness relies on my neurons. So my consciousness really is my neurons. It's not something more than matter. There's various ways they would parse that out, but for simplicity's sake. So you had materialism with the pre-Socratics, and then Socrates says, well, we have a soul, and Socrates says that his soul is going to be judged after he dies, and he'll be happy after he dies or unhappy depending how he lived. So Socrates is defending there's not just a body but a soul as well, and living in, right, most of us we have some idea of what the soul means, right, that it's immaterial and so on. And so Plato's view on human nature is that I'm just a soul, so my body isn't really me. So that's called dualism, because I'm two separate things. I'm really a body. I'm really a soul, but then it's somehow attached to a body. So I'm two separate things, but the goal is to free myself from the body. So then Aristotle comes along. He's at age 17, he enters Plato's academy. He stays there for 20 years, so until he's 37. And then he finally left the academy. But so he knew Plato's writings, his thought extremely well. And he comes up with a different view, really a contrasting viewpoint, which is that we're both soul and body. So that I'm both a soul and a body. So that's called hylomorphism, because hule in Greek means matter and morphe means form. So the soul is my form and the body is my matter. Mm-hmm. But these are analogical terms. So they're not just, it's not like the form, like the shape of a circle. It's something different than that. It's also matter represents potency and form represents act, is the way that you really, I think, can best understand it. Act meaning here like actualization and what you call entitative act. So it's not like me moving around, that kind of act. It's an actualization of something. So we could talk more about that later if you want. But that's like the core of hylomorphism of Aristotle, which Thomas then builds on. So I'm a unified composite.
Mark, let me, can you repeat about holomorphism? Because this is a huge point. If people get at least some direction of this, can you repeat it just one more time?
Right. So Aristotle, I mean, it kind of takes you back to Aristotle. So Aristotle says that, take an eye, he says an eye without vision, right? He says the eye is an organ, but then the power of vision isn't, I can't put I can, I don't know, do experiments on my eye, but I can't do experiments on my power of vision as such. I mean, it's either operating or it's not, but that's a potency that I can't put in the test tube. And so the same way he says that he says the eye without the power of vision isn't really an eye. So let's say that someone dies and then, you know, you have their eye. I mean, when I was in high school, remember they gave us a sheep eye. And I was just looking at it. Well, Aristotle would say that's not really an eye. It has the matter of an eye, but the soul is not present there. So it can't function as an eye, and therefore it's not truly an eye. This is in the De Anima. And he says this, so the same way that you have matter and then you have a power, the Greek word is dunamis, you can translate it as power, capability, capacity, potentiality, all those different ways of translating the dunamis idea, which is where we get our word dynamic in English. So that's the potency, and then the act is in Greek is energeia. That's where we get our word energy. So even the English language and the language of science kind of enshrines some of these Aristotelian distinctions. So on some level, they are familiar to us. The distinction between potential and kinetic energy, that goes back to Aristotle. You don't have that in Plato or in the Pre-Socratics. So that's his contribution. So that would be maybe an easy way to understand it. And so the same way you have the eye, and then like the sheep eye that I was holding in my hand, the thing to meditate on or reflect on is how is that different from the living sheep, the eye in the living sheep that's seeing things. And there's something different there. And for Aristotle, it's the difference between act or form and matter, or I should say informed matter and just mere matter. The eye, that I was holding in my hand, that's just mere matter without the form of the soul, which actualizes it and makes it alive. In the same way, the cadaver has all the structures and all the molecules and it's all there at the instant after someone dies, right? All the matter is there. However many cells, how much water, the hair, and yet there's something missing, right? And that's the soul. So the same way the eye that I was holding in my hand, he says it's not really an eye. The cadaver is not really a human.
Mark,
because the soul
that is beautifully put. I think that was a great way of
Well, it's Aristotle, so it's not me.
Yes. All right.
So the thing is, they're not. It's like I am one thing. I'm not. For Plato, I was two things. I'm a soul, which is like an angel, and then there's this body that I'm stuck to, and I want to get free from. And Aristotle's thing is, no, I'm one thing. I'm one entity, but I have two kind of aspects. I have my body and my soul. But when you see me, you see an ensouled body, or you see an embodied soul. You're not, in a sense, I'm not just a body. I'm a composite of. I'm a combination of these two. Well, he doesn't call them things. They're two aspects.
Excellent. Okay, so now let's look at shall we look at the human being? Do you want to go along the line of Aristotle, or whichever way you want to explain it? Go ahead.
Yeah. So now we've established, at least I presented maybe hylomorphism. So now, which is right, Aristotelian and Thomistic. And so now the question is, what powers do we have? So we share many powers with plants and animals. With animals and plants share what Aristotle calls nutritive powers, which are, and Thomas calls them vegetative, but so growth, reproduction, and then nutrition. So those are the vegetative powers. And then the animal soul adds on to that powers of sensation and then appetite in a broad sense of the term. So we share those powers with like a gorilla, for example. And the cogitative is one of the sensory powers. And then above the sensory powers, we have our intellect and our will. which animals lack. So animals don't have free will. And I mean, it is observable. You can deny it if you want, but commonsensically, we see that animals don't have free will. That's to be another conversation. But and that they don't have intellect. The most obvious sign of their lack of intellect, or maybe the two most obvious signs, are lack of language and lack of or absence of mathematical ability, and any kind of beyond very rudimentary. And even that isn't. People often misrepresent what's the achievements, the actual achievements that brute animals are capable of. So that's the panoply of the powers of, they're called the powers of the soul, but I mean, they're really powers of the soul and the body. As I said, right, the power of vision is, without my eye, there could be, no vision. So it's both the soul and the body. So that's the outline of the powers of the soul.
Okay. Now, Aquinas takes it quite a bit further in terms of kind of seeing how things are put together. We went through this essay by Pegher, which was a, great kind of summary of Thomas's views. So he talks about the inner senses. He talks about the common sense, the imagination, memory, cogitative sense. So can we talk about how Thomas looks at the ecology of inner senses?
Right. So what Thomas is, the triad, the Aristotelian triad, is the common sense, so you have the external senses, which are obvious, right? Sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. The common sense unites, it allows me to sense something as a unified sensory object. So when I have more than one sense operating regarding the same thing, this common sense is how I'm aware that it's the same thing. So that's what the common sense does, among other things. And then, so let's say the apple, right? So I the smell, the taste, the texture, the appearance, and I guess the sound of an apple when I drop it, it makes a kind of thud, or I bite it, it's kind of like this crackly sound. So there's technical terminology called a phantasm. So that's all incorporated into the phantasm, right? My common sense is how I know that it's the same thing, that what I'm biting and what I'm tasting are the same, which I know that seems obvious, but a lot of what philosophers do is explain, at least Aristotelian philosophy, it explains what would seem obvious, and other philosophers are going to deny that it's obvious. So it's important to do that. So that's incorporated into the phantasm, which is the Greek word for image. So you could call an image, the problem with calling an image is this, that when we think of an image, we think of a picture, but the phantasm of the apple is not just the picture, it's also the texture, the taste, the smell. So that's all incorporated. And that's retained in the imagination for Aristotle. And then memory for him is how I'm aware that I perceive something in the past. So that's the triad, right, of common sense, imagination, and then memory. And that was worked pretty well for over 1,000 years. So Aristotle died in 322, let's say, and then the Arab-speaking philosophers are the ones who were working on Aristotle, let's say, starting in 800-ish, about year 800. So you had the whole Greek commentatorial tradition that went on for, up until, let's say, 500. So what is that? Not quite a millennium. And then that segued into the Arabic tradition, because Islam spread and it kind of created an Arabic-speaking empire over a large portion of the world. So that took over the Christian parts. And so the Arabs started a translation movement, translating Aristotle to Arabic, because for them, right, for Islam, Arabic is this special sacred language. So they're translating Aristotle, and then they started commenting on Aristotle themselves. And really, I mean, Avicenna is the one that we have to thank for the Cogitative. So his name is Ibn Sina in Arabic. So his major work in the year 1021, he was writing his Ashifa, which means the cure. So this is really not going to be familiar to almost anyone. Most people have heard of Plato and Aristotle. And he's familiar with the threefold division that's in Aristotle's book on the soul. And Aristotle has a lot to say about imagination, and Aristotle writes in a very extremely encapsulated way. And so I think, so Aristotle writes incredibly terse. That's part of why you had 800 years of commentary on him. And really the commentary continued up until the 1700s. So really you have 2000 years of commenting on Aristotle. And people are still commenting on Aristotle. So I guess you have 2,300 years of commenting on Aristotle, because his writing lends itself to that, because it's so terse. And even in the Greek, there's so much it's like a puzzle that he wants you to figure out, that he's leaving you to figure out. So I think Avicenna realized that it would be helpful to kind of break Aristotelian imagination up into several functions and therefore several powers. Mm-hmm. And so what he did was he had a fivefold division of the internal senses, and he's the first one to regularize in the Aristotelian commensurial tradition, to regularize the term in internal senses. It's, my Arabic unfortunately is not very good, but it's hawas al-batina, however you say that in Arabic. Mm-hmm. So that's his term to call them the internal senses. So he keeps the common sense. And then what he does is I think he was interested in what the animal soul. Mm-hmm. And so he introduces, so you still have the common sense, imagination, and memory, but he's going to change the functions of the latter too. And he makes this fundamental distinction, and this is, I'll just explain it. And people would always ask me about it later, but between a phantasm, let's call it, or an image, and then what he calls an idea. The word is mahna in Arabic, and people have written books about that word. It's a very complex word, but you could translate it as meaning or idea. So the image and the meaning, depending how you want to translate that word. And so he says that animals can kind of, they have an idea of something being harmful, they see the meaning of it as being harmful, let's say. So his example is the sheep and the wolf. So it's one thing, right, the visual imprint or the visual impression of the wolf, right? But then the fact there's an awareness in the sheep that's a threat. On some level, there's an awareness of a threat. And so that classifying or perceiving the wolf as a threat, he calls that this makna, or meaning or idea. It applies, or it sees it as a threat. That's different from the image. Mm-hmm. And so that the power that perceives threats is called the estimative power. Mm-hmm. So he introduced the estimative power, and I think he was right to do that. And so it's interesting, it's impressive, because he wrote in 1021, so for 1,300 years, people had just commented on Aristotle, debated about it. Most people accepted that triad, as I said, but he sees a reason, he's willing to add a new power, which is pretty exceptional. And then he adds another power called the cogitative, which is actually mufakira, which literally kind of means the judging power. And so what he says that does is it combines images, and it combines images and ideas. And he says that you really have to read the article to keep all track of all this in your head, but I'm just telling you what he says. So welcome to philosophy. I never said it'd be simple.
No, please. This is very clear as it can get. And the article is linked down here. So if you're not able to follow it, just read the article and come back again. Go ahead.
Right, so you have to kind of, I mean, what can I say? This is medieval philosophy, but I think it has a lot to offer us in the modern and postmodern world. So you have the common sense, then you have the imagination, which is what receives and stores images. Then you have the estimative, which makes a judgment about harm or benefit. Then you have the memorative, which retains the notion of harm or benefit. So retains the idea. His example is like, I think he gives the example of a dog and the stick. So when the master picks up the stick, the dog remembers that that's something harmful, and it reacts immediately. He doesn't have to hit it again in order for it to know that it's something dangerous. So I like to think of, when I was a kid, we had a cat. And when I take out the tuna fish, as soon as I took out the tuna fish, the cat would run up. So there's no smell of tuna fish coming from that can, but it remembered that was something good. And so it's making a connection there. So that's higher level than just remembering an image. It's kind of a higher order. So that common sense, that the imagination, which retains images. Then you have the estimative power, which he says is the ruling power in animals. So he's going more into animal psychology than Aristotle did. Then you have the power that can form new images. And he says in animals, that's called the imaginative power. And in humans, it's called the cogitative power. So it can do something more in humans than it can do in animals because it's in continuity with intellect. And then fifth, you have the memorative power, which is what retains the associations or those, like I said, that the stick is harmful, or that the tuna fish can is something beneficial, even though right now the cat is not smelling or tasting or seeing tuna. So that's what Avicenna does.
This is all Avicenna. This is brilliant.
Right. So it's interesting because I mean most people have never heard of Avicenna, but so what's interesting is that Thomas, right? Avicenna was translated into Latin in Spain because in Spain was part of under Islam at the time. And there we know the names of the people, a lot of people who did that. So there was a canon, a priest in Toledo who, if I remember the details correctly, who translated with, I think, the help of a rabbi who spoke Arabic. So they translated Avicenna from Arabic to Latin. And so that's how the Latin West received the fivefold division of internal senses. And it was quite popular. So a lot of them accepted it. The translator did because he wrote a book on the soul, and because you could say it's more fine-tuned than what you had in Aristotle. So it's not rejecting Aristotle, it's not denying Aristotle at all. It's just it allows you, I think you can do a better job when you have the fivefold division than just with Aristotle's threefold. So yeah.
Absolutely. This is wonderful. This is wonderful. I mean, the thing is that I did not know that all of this is done by Avicenna. I thought some of it was Thomas doing this. So
no.
What is okay, go ahead.
So that's why I ended up working. That's part of why this book has taken me. I guess I'm going for a record, the longest time to write a book at this point.
I think
it's a new kind of record.
It's very valuable to kind of see how these ideas develop, because you understand them much better when you see them in the stages.
Yeah, in a sense, to do philosophy for Thomas is also to do the history of philosophy. Because if you don't know the history of philosophy, you're just condemned to reinventing the wheel. Like you're going to come up with things that, like atomism. Oh, well, atomism, Democritus talked about that in 450 BC. So even atoms, like we all talk about atoms, well, that's several thousand years old. So it's important to know the history of philosophy and not just pretend that that's all irrelevant, because to understand these ideas, I mean, Avicenna had thought about these things, and I consider him a genius too. Mm-hmm. So he had a real contribution, which influenced Aquinas adopted to a considerable degree.
Wonderful. So what did Aquinas do with what he got from?
Well, do you want to hear about Averroes? Do you want me to skip that?
You tell me. You tell me. And so far, everything that you said has been completely to the point. I guess I'm building up the whole thing. So please tell me.
In for a penny, in for a pound, right? I guess I'll tell you about Averroes because it's not really fair not to. So this is. I mean, I have all this stuff. This is the Latin translation of Averroes. Averroes wrote 3 commentaries. So on each of Aristotle's works, major works. So it's kind of. So Avicenna, right? Like I said, he was writing about the year 1000, and he died pretty young, I think in his 50s. And he was in. I think like modern day, he was from like Uzbekistan, and he was from the eastern part of the Islamic area. In the western part, you had in Spain, actually, in Cordoba, you had the philosopher Averroes. So he's one of the big 3 Arabic speaking would be Avicenna, Averroes, and then Al-Ghazali. And Averroes in that order, actually chronologically. And Averroes wrote commentaries, as I said. So he has on the De Anima, for example, on the soul, he has a short, a middle, and a long commentary. Mm-hmm. And the long commentary is, is quite long, as his name would imply. So he changed his views in each of those, but the long commentary is his mature account, right? So a lot of times philosophers, you don't really know you don't get their definitive view until maybe they're, in that case, he was probably in his 60s. So coming back to it for the 3rd time. And of course, even though he's commenting on Aristotle, of course, he's conversant, right, with the Arabic tradition. So he wants to disagree with Avicenna. So he's like, well, what is this novelty? You know, Aristotle's the philosopher, right? Aristotle's the who can compare with Aristotle, right? So he disagrees. He says we don't need this estimate of power. You know, Aristotle didn't have it, so I'm getting rid of it.
Mhm.
So see how it already within 100 years, I guess, of Avicenna's death, Averroes in Latin, Arabic, his name is Ibn Rushd, but he rejects the estimative, and he says, well, the animal imagination can handle that. It just remembers that, you know, the stick is painful. There's no need to invoke this idea of, you know, threat and so on. So of course he gives the common sense. Of course he gives the triad, right? That's straight from Aristotle. So that's only to be expected, because after all, his whole way of perceiving philosophy is that the best thing you could do is to comment on Aristotle. Mm-hmm. But perhaps a little bit, maybe, I don't know if it's surprising, he keeps the cogitative power. So he for him, there's 4 internal senses. So he has the common sense, imagination, then the cogitative power, and then memory. Mm-hmm. And he keeps that. So for humans, he does keep the idea of something, and this magna, this notion that's higher than an image but lower than an intellectual concept. Mm-hmm. And so for individuals, for example, so like an individual like Socrates, he says you can't have a universal concept for them, but you have this individual idea. And he says that's in the cogitative power. So he keeps the cogitative power, mm-hmm. but he rejects it. So he keeps it for humans, but gets rid of it for animals. And then, so that's Averroes. And so Averroes is also translated. And like I said, the precise details, you know, it was in Spain. I mean, that much I'm positive about. So he was also translated in the 1100s, I mean, not long after he died, because I think he died around 1110 or something like that. He made it to the 1100s. Mm-hmm. And then he's translated. So now you have both Avicenna in Latin, and you'll say Latin Avicenna and Latin Averroes. Mm-hmm. And then we have text, right? You know, we have text from people like some anonymous teacher in Paris in 1250, right? That's still in a library someplace, and someone will edit it. And so you might have some anonymous teacher who goes with Averroes, that there's 4 internal senses. You might have another one who goes with Avicenna, there's 5. You might have another one just goes with straight Aristotle, and there's 3. Mm-hmm. You even have people just say, oh, we don't even need 3. Let's just say there's 1. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's the situation where Thomas comes in.
All right. So what does Thomas do with all of this?
So basically, and this is in the Summa Theologica, right, which you can find online in a microsecond, and then in another couple of seconds you can find it. It's the Prima Pars, question 78, article 4. So that's the only ex professo treatment of the internal senses in his whole corpus. That's the only time he ever asked the questions, you know, what are the internal senses? And what he says is that, so basically he kind of compromises between Averroes and Avicenna. So he agrees with Averroes that there's only 4. So he doesn't think there's 5, but he agrees with Avicenna that we should keep the estimated power. So he kind of compromises. And what that gives you then is the 4-fold internal senses, the common sense, imagination, which Thomas usually calls imaginative power. Then in the animals, the estimative power; in human, the cogitative power, and then the memorative power, which doesn't retain my pictures or sensations at all. It retains those associations of harm or benefit on an animal level, which is where it gets interesting for contemporary psychology, like Freud or Jung. And then it retains, like Socrates, individual identities of people. So every person that you know, that's retained. Every human being that you can name or you can recognize, that's all retained in your memorative power.
Can you repeat how he integrates the 4 and the 5 again? What does he do with
so remember, Averroes is like, oh, what is this novelty, estimate of power? That's not Aristotle. And it's true, it wasn't. I mean, Aristotle kind of talks about that, but he certainly, the Arabic term is wahm, W-A-H-M, or wamia. So that's Avicenna's contribution. And so Thomas he keeps that, even though it's not an Aristotle. So he's willing to view the tradition as a living tradition. And that's what we're part of. That's what this Dianoeticon journal is part of, right? We're trying to keep that tradition alive because it has wisdom. Mm-hmm. And when wisdom is lost, right, society kind of veers off its bearings. And if we don't have wisdom in our lives, we kind of can go astray. So so Thomas keeps he takes the living tradition approach and keeps the estimative power, but he does narrow it down to 4 instead of 5. So where Avicenna kind of split the imagination in 2, he said you have the retentive imagination, which retains like images, like the phantasm of the apple, like I talked about, and then you have what he called the imaginative power. So the imaginative power is what we would call creative imagination. So creative imagination, like Avicenna's example is the gold mountain, right? I take the image of gold and I put that with the image of mountain, and now I have a gold mountain. So Thomas just says, oh, that's just all imagination. We don't need to split that into 2 different powers. So that's how he ends up with, instead of 5, 4.
Got it. So now, I mean, the big one is the cogitative power. So now I want to see how to approach it. Do you want to kind of quickly, now let's talk only about Thomas now. Okay, so we'll keep everything as a background. You know, we built everything very beautifully. So now, can you crisply summarize the powers other than the cogitative power?
Well, right. So remember, the cogitative and estimative are the same power for Thomas. The difference is, so in animals it's called the estimative, but because we have an intellect, our soul, the powers of our soul are, my internal senses are in continuity with my intellect. So therefore, he says in 174 that the estimative power receives a new name in humans. It's called the cogitative power because in us, it's in continuity with intellect, which Avicenna had said too. So what I do is in this article, and really all the way back in my dissertation, because the article is somewhat based on my dissertation and the book is based on my dissertation. And so I divide it into two, the estimative acts or the human estimative acts. So Thomas, basically, he used that idea, even though he doesn't use precisely that terminology. But there are certain scholars that had kind of pointed that out. So I'm kind of building on, they kind of mentioned in passing, and then that's how a lot of scholarship works, right? They mention it in passing, and then I decide to like make a big deal out of it. So the human estimative does the same thing as the brute estimative. There are 2 acts that it has, and this is my dissertation goes into this, which is online on my website, the cogitative-power.blogspot. If you want to,
I'll put a link.
Read a couple hundred pages at some point. It's so the human estimative does it perceives those notions of harm or benefit, like the sheep and the wolf, which can also take place in humans, right? We have instinctive reactions as well. So the example that Thomas gives is the infant and like nursing. So the infant doesn't have to be taught to seek its mother's breast. It doesn't have to be taught to nurse. It just knows that. So that would be like the estimative, recognizing that as beneficial without any prior experience, right? And then the other one is individual ideas or notions. And so that's like Socrates and so on. So notions of individuals. So, because certainly like even your pet, right? You can tell that your pet can tell you from maybe your wife, from your son, that animals can distinguish individuals. I mean, that's obvious, I think. So those are the 2 acts of the human estimative. And then, so what I do is just kind of, right, as a scholar, I'm reading Thomas, but I don't want to just parrot Thomas, because then you could just read him yourself. I could just give you a list of excerpts from Thomas. So I'm trying to think of something, that's maybe helpful. So the cogitative has 3 different names, which is another reason that the scholarship on it has kind of gotten left by the wayside, and it tends to get forgotten and overlooked, not infrequently, because he actually, as often as not, he doesn't call it the cogitative power. He calls it either the particular reason or he calls it passive intellect, both of which terms are from Aristotle, right? So Thomas is still very much Aristotelian. He's not really, he's using Avicenna's contributions and Averroes' contributions to some degree, but he's really, it's all under the aegis of Aristotle. So because Aristotle had talked about a passive intellect, he calls it that, and he calls it a particular reason. And that has definitely, I think, generated a certain amount of confusion, because when people hear passive intellect, they're like, oh, that's my intellect. But no, it's not your intellect. But I mean, you can't really blame Thomas, because Aristotle himself called it that. So that's just, Aristotle was writing really fast. And like I said, it's very dense. But so what I do is I just call it particular reason. So I say, okay, there's a human estimative, and then let's talk about particular reason for the other 4 acts. And those acts, well, so it forms the minor and a practical syllogism. So I watched a little bit of the videos of you guys had conversations about this before that you guys recorded. So I watched a little bit of those, and I saw, you were talking about that, the practical syllogism. So it forms the minor with the practical syllogism. It plays a role in reflection. So it's basically the interface between my intellect and my imagination. Then I'm trying to think, I'm just doing it offhand here. Then it plays, well, any kind of particular reasoning. So not just a practical syllogism, but I would argue even any kind of syllogism. A syllogism is a reasoning process in your mind. Any reasoning process in your mind that involves a singular entity. Singular just means like a particular, an individual. And we could maybe talk about that more later, but the cogitative is required for that. So yeah, so that's
Okay.
Those are the things that it does as particular reason.
Absolutely. So let's go into details of this, because this is really the heart of the whole thing. Because the way I see it, again, I'm very new to this. So when I read, the Pegger's paper and learned about the cogitative, about the ecology of inner senses, I said, the linchpin is the cogitative. If you understand the cogitative, you have everything, because everything else is kind of either feeds into it or,
Right,
is a product of it. It's like the center of our kind of our faculties, inner faculties. So let us spend a little bit of time on it. So one of the things that I've really found fascinating is that it kind of takes in stuff from the senses and the imagination, which has combined those things, and it is able to kind of form patterns, use kind of pattern in order to connect them to abstraction. So it's like a top-down, a bottom-up kind of a process going on. At the same time, it is taking general principles and general concepts, and it is seeing its applications to particulars. It's also taking it's also at the same time a moral faculty. So on one hand, it is epistemological. It's doing a lot of epistemological work of, kind of taking things almost like is involved in the inductive process. It's also involved in the deductive process at an epistemological level. It's also involved in the moral issue. It is taking all the moral principles and it is applying. So it is like the combination. It is keeping track of all the metaphysics which is guiding it. So it is the way in which we are actually living using philosophy that we have. I don't know, but that's my sense of it. So it's a huge thing. If we understand that, we understand a lot.
Right. Yeah, no, you put it very well, exactly. And so that's why, there's a lot that one could say about it. And so the thing is, it tends to get forgotten. So after Aquinas, so Albert also, his terminology is different, but without worrying about that. So his terminology is completely different from Thomas's. It's much more like Avicenna's. But that being said, Albert the Great was Thomas Aquinas' teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And he also had a kind of rich, account of the internal senses. And then after Aquinas, the estimate of cogitative kind of disappear rather quickly. So the Dominicans will still talk about them. So followers of Thomas, there's a whole tradition, Thomistic tradition. But other than that, they really they pretty much disappear, the cogitative and estimative. And people go back to either common sense, imagination, and memory, like in Aristotle, or they just, sometimes they'll say, well, there's just imagination and that does everything. It's my memory and it's my common sense. So for example, the big 3 Latin medievals are Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and Occam. Scotus mentions the estimative in passing once or twice, but he doesn't really have anything to say about it as far as I know. And then Occam just gets rid of it entirely. So Occam gets rid of the estimative and cogitative entirely, and he's one who just says, you just have an imagination. You don't need a common sense. You don't need a memory. That's all just imagination. So, and then that sets things up for the moderns, where the cogitative and estimative just are gone. And so what happens in Occam is the intellect takes over all of that. So a big issue here in terms of epistemology is the question of whether the intellect can know individuals. So for Thomas, he reads Aristotle, and I think he's basically right about this. I mean, he says the intellect's object is universal. So like the nature of a human, right? Human nature, the word human, the word cow, dog, those are universals. But then Socrates or Phaedo, those are individuals. And so for Aristotle, it was my imagination that recognizes those things. And for Thomas, my cogitative is what recognizes individuals. And then Occam says that my intellect can know individuals directly. So the Franciscan tradition, Occam and Scotus are both Franciscans. Scotus says, and Scotus is born, Scotus is writing like only 30 years after Aquinas. Duns Scotus, right, obviously from Scotland, right? And Scotus says that my intellect can directly know individuals. And then, so he still mentions the estimative. He never mentions the cogitative. I'm sure he got rid of it. But what purpose would it serve, the cogitative? Because my intellect can know individuals directly. So therefore, there's no need for the cogitative. And then Occam, but he still mentions the estimative for like a sheep, like that, the standard sheep and wolf example. And then Occam just says that only my intellect can form judgments. So like the judgment that, Socrates is human, and he says that's my intellect that does that. So there's no need for any cogitative power at all. And then it never came back after that. Mm-hmm. So that's what happened to it. So someone who wanted to disagree with Thomas, they'd say, oh, well, this is unnecessarily complicated. Why not just get rid of it? And I would say the reason you can't not to get rid of it is because it's going to lead to a kind of dualistic anthropology. So Occam's anthropology is that we have two souls. I have an intellectual soul and I have a sensory soul. So hopefully it doesn't take too much imagination that this is dualistic, right? I have two souls that are really distinct, not just like mentally, because big thing in the medievals is, you have different distinctions, you have real distinction, mental distinction, and so on. But he says these are two really distinct souls. And he says that I can only know I have an intellectual soul by faith. I can't know that by reason. So the whole Thomistic edifice, this kind of like a huge cathedral where everything fits and faith and reason all fits together, Occam starts to kind of demolish that. So I can only know that I have an intellectual soul by reason, by faith. By reason, I would think I just have a sensory soul, just like an animal. I would think that when I die, there's no afterlife. So that's kind of a step in the direction of Protestantism, where the intellect, the human reason, that can't really discover truth anymore without, at least about God and the soul, without faith. So you be seeing the lead up to Thomas and Albert, and then the aftermath is Scotus rejecting the cogitative because your intellect can know individuals just fine, and then Occam rejecting, really for him, there's just one internal sense, which is your imagination. And any judgment that you make has to be your intellect. So your imagination is just like the words and the pictures, but so that's where, and then the moderns, they tend to be very de facto, they're following Occam, whether or not they know that. So that's why it disappeared. And that's why if you any of you who are listening, if you've never heard this before, until maybe if you watch the Thomistic Institute little videos, you'll hear of it. You're like, what's that? Well, I had the same reaction, because Occam is in the 1300s. So 700 years ago, Occam, founded a school, and Scotus rejected it. So the three medieval schools in like the 1400s were Thomistic, Scotistic, and Occamist. So pretty much every major European university had a chair in each of those schools with like those three competing views, and so the Thomists, you would have heard about it, but not from the others. And then in modernity, they're following Occam. So,
Mark, this is exceptionally clear picture.
Thank you.
That you've painted, because the thing that I really like about it is kind of linking it back to duality versus, Aristotle versus Plato. That's what it comes down to, right? I mean, it's kind of separation of the intellect completely from the senses. And so I think again, putting it from why cogitative faculty is the thing that is making it one.
Right. Right. It keeps us from being a ghost in a machine. Gilbert Ryle famously used that expression to caricature Cartesian dualism. And that's the tendency is for a lot of philosophers, you're either materialist or there's a spirit that's somehow attached to the machine, which is Descartes' viewpoint. And the cogitative allows you to avoid that because, it's so if I formulate a sentence, so if I say Socrates is human, it's a joint activity of my cogitative power that my memorative supplies my notion of Socrates. My cogitative forms that sentence, that judgment. So it's not both my cogitative and my intellect can judge against Occam, who said only my intellect can judge. What my intellect provides for Thomas is the meaning of the word human, because that's a universal concept. So remember, we're talking about human nature. Only my intellect can grasp human nature, but for Thomas, only my cogitative can deal with singulars. So it's basically a joint activity of two things at once. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Powers.
So I want to do two things now. I want to go through this list that you have of 6 cogitative functions in enough detail so people can grasp what each of those are. Because what I want to do is, I think we've established what the cogitative faculty is, but I want people, because it is so foreign to people today. Okay, I want to take time to kind of talk about these 6 functions, and then we will close with something on kind of, taking it to the modern conversation and see kind of different modern things and how, to what extent they capture or don't capture what we've been talking about. And then we'll open it up to questions. So folks, if you have questions, keep track of questions. Ask your best question. Okay, so we're coming to question answers soon. All right, so what are these 6 cognitive functions of the cogitative faculty?
So the first one perceives the notions of harm or benefit. So that's the famous sheep and wolf example, right? It's why does it run away, right? There's a brown furry object. I mean, if you describe it strictly in terms of the visual impression or the visual field, why does it react to that, right? And the answer is for Avicenna and Aquinas that it's able to perceive either innately, right? So an example of that is, if you have mouse that's never been exposed to a cat and smells a cat, it will seek shelter. So that's innate, right? It's just born that way, but it doesn't just smell it, it associates danger with that. So the association of danger, that's the first one. It could be innate or acquired, as I talked about before. Then perceiving individual notions like Socrates, or in the case of an animal, distinguishing different members of the family or other animals in a non-linguistic fashion. And then particular reason prepares the phantasms for abstraction. Well, like you were saying, right? Good. It's patterns. That would be a good way to put it. In order to prepare for, like, you don't just leap into knowledge of human nature or recognition of different natural kinds. There's a gradual process in infancy, and even for us as adults, there can be, especially with something like metaphysics, like the notion of substance and accident. There can be a gradual process. So your cogitative is at work trying to put things together in a way that makes sense, which is also why it's fatiguing, right? Intellectual work. Well, it's also your cogitative, I guess, not just your intellect. So then the fourth one, instrumental role in knowledge of the singular. So remember I said that for Thomas, there's no direct intellectual knowledge of the singular, but there is indirect knowledge of the singular. So if I know Socrates, my intellect has indirect knowledge of that by reflecting on my image of Socrates. So it reflects on that. And so it kind of knows it indirectly, which would be kind of a whole nother topic of conversation. But the point is that it's not like my intellect is completely unaware of singulars, because then that would be a kind of dualism or duality, right, within the human person. And it would look a little more like Occam with the two souls, right? So there's a continuity between the intellect and the cogitative, and the intellect reflects on the lower knowledge. And then, so that sense, I mean, has to do with my consciousness, right? My consciousness of myself, and so on. Then forms the minor of the practical syllogism. So, the example comes from Aristotle, right? If all sons should honor their fathers, this man is my father, therefore I should honor him. So the major premise, if any of you, one begins the study of philosophy with logic. The major premise is universal, because right, it has the word all in it. And then the minor premises are singular because they're dealing with singular, they have singular terms. And so that's the cogitative that forms both of those. And that does tend to get overlooked a lot. Not always, maybe less so in recent years by scholars. And then lastly, reasons from one singular thing to another. So I think that's just broadening it out to whether it's, because I just gave an example of a practical syllogism, the conclusion of which is something that I should do, right? An action I should take in the world, as opposed to all humans are language users, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is a language user. Like you said, that's a deduction, and the cogitative would be responsible for the second two steps.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. All right, now what I want to do is, let's see, we are about an hour into this. So I want to give a chance for people to ask questions, because there's some really incredible people here, and I want to make sure that we get them involved too. And I don't want to, we'll figure out how to proceed from there. We will have time for breakout rooms afterwards. So folks, it's time for questions. We have 4 rules as always. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you want to ask a question, or raise your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with on anything with anybody, and do so courteously. First up is, give me just a second. Let me go ahead and enable this. First up is Mark. Mark, go ahead.
Shrikant, thank you so much for inviting Mark Barker. Good to see you again, Mark. I was actually recounting to some people today that when you and I first met in 2016, that was a real milestone in my early education on these topics. I learned a lot from you in Huntington, and I'll always be very grateful for that. Thank you very much. And also thank you for agreeing to send along to us your essay so we could publish it in Diana Wedicon. My question for you is neuroscience. As I understand it, the inner senses, or internal or interior, depending on who's speaking, we like to call it the inner senses. The inner senses are material. They are expressed in brain tissues. And in general, these are going to be, as you may have enjoyed, I don't know if you'd seen Ruth Harvey's presentation at Warburg before we published it, but there's a long history of trying to locate in the neuroanatomy, not in the neocortex, but in all the various structures and ventricles beneath that. There's a long history of trying to locate these inner senses. So my question for you is, are you aware of anyone, or if you're not, what do you think we need to do to get some modern neuroscientists to look at these questions? I believe that Daniel Dehaan at Oxford has taken a look at some of this. We've recently been in conversation, I don't know if you Father Ezra Sullivan at the Angelicum. He is a Dominican who is looking very seriously at these things, but I have yet to find anybody who is actively involved in neuroscience and engaged with these questions. Have you heard of any of that? And if not, what can we do to accelerate it?
Well, so in my dissertation, there's one article by Magda B. Arnold, who I know you know about, and you had told me about some of her books that I wasn't aware of. I had just seen that one article, and then her co-author on that article, it's called The Internal Senses, Functions or Powers, and it's in 2 parts. And that would be kind of a seminal, I guess, article, because to my knowledge, that's the first person to really try to tackle that question head on and take the cogitative seriously and the essence seriously, but still look at the neuroscience, is neurophysiology, right? What brain centers are responsible? So that's what I know of. And then beyond that, right, you'd have to have a kind of cooperation there between someone who knows what these powers are, and then which brain centers are responsible for them. And I mean, honestly, I don't know if it would be too hard to figure out, but yeah, I'm not really, that's not really what I've worked on. So yeah, I don't know, but I know Dan Denhan has maybe worked on that a bit more. So maybe you could, yeah, ask him or someone else. But and I hadn't heard of this other Dominican you talked about. So that's good if some people are working on it.
There is, as you also probably know, there's an enormous conversation about these topics in Spanish, primarily being conducted by Opus Dei. And so that's another avenue for this. But I'm just indicating that the next step for the Center for the Study of Digital Life, in terms of looking at this, will probably be to try to encourage some neuroscientific examination of this. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure.
Wonderful. Thank you, both Marks. Next up is Brian, Peter, and Franklin. Brian.
Yes, I'm fascinated by this. Anytime I hear the word dualism, because I'm not formally trained in philosophy, but it seems to me that dualism is at the heart of a lot of key philosophical debates when it comes to mind and humanity's attempt to understand what mind is, certainly since the classical Greeks. So you said something, cogitative allows us to avoid dualism. So I'm curious if you could just briefly explain what that means and give an example or two.
Sure. So so what you tend to have is well, from Thomas's perspective, an overemphasis on intellect, so that the intellect just does everything. So if you're Duns Scotus, just to take people after Thomas, who's, you know, the medievals are extremely sophisticated in their epistemology and anthropology, and so for Scotus, my intellect does all that. So there's no need for the cogitative anymore. But then it's minimizing kind of the body's role. So the cogitative is an embodied power, right? So like Mark Stone was saying, it's localized. I use the word localized, not located. It's localized in your brain. All the inner senses are. And so we're giving a lot of importance to like what your brain does in your cognition. And it means like after we die, our intellectual soul lives on, but we don't really know what that'll be like because we won't have an imagination anymore and we won't have cogitative anymore. So we'll think in a very different way. Whereas for someone like Scotus, well, my mind, my intellect already knows individuals. And then you kind of see the endpoint of that dualism with Ockham will go so far as to say I have two different, really different or distinct souls. So, I mean, it's almost like at that point, well, then are there two me's, or am I two persons, or am I one person? So it's a more holistic approach, right? Where it's a both and equation that, like I said before, as I make my way through the world, right? Existentialists speak about that kind of thing. People like Heidegger. Heidegger was trying to go back to the things themselves, right? Following Husserl, and in a sense, that's what the cogitative was doing. The cogitative is it's talking about how I make my way through the world, because the world is filled with concrete individual things and entities, not just abstractions. So it's kind of giving the due to the concrete, if you will, which is a kind of move that you had in the postmodern period. With, like I said, Heidegger and the existentialists, Sartre, the whole bunch of them, that whole movement. So in that sense, the cogitative matches up with kind of anti-intellectualist features of the existentialists. And so that's, in that sense, it has something to contribute to the contemporary conversation in a way that intellectualists don't, because existentialists are rejecting Cartesian, rationalism, and they're definitely, Heidegger is definitely rejecting any kind of intellectualism, and he wants to focus on kind of our experience of the world around us and how do we actually experience the world, which is so far removed from the whole rationalist or modern approach. So that's how, right, it kind of plays out. The holistic approach would play out.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Peter, Franklin, Laura, and Kevin. Peter, go ahead.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think this may be the first time we've met even digitally, although maybe I'm mistaken. But yeah, I am just so happy that there's somewhere on YouTube now where this has really been elaborated at the level that it really needs to be. So first off, I just want to thank you, and again, Shrikant for hosting this. The question that I have is sort of a bit of a historical one. I was curious how you see, how. So we talked about the development of the cogitative power as it came from the Arabic world into the Latin world via Spain, and then eventually at the University of Paris, where it was housed in all these schools. I wanted to mention that historically, there's a, Bishop Nemesius in Syria wrote a book called On the Nature of Man, where to bring the neurology in, he talks about these ventricles, as far as I can tell, for the first time in these terms. He uses the word ex cogitativa instead of cogitative. But this premise of there being ventricles in the brain that are assigned these various powers, with all the implications, I suppose, of humoral action, of wetness and dryness. Why do you think it is that in the 15th and 16th century, these became sort of not even on the table to be debated, rather than being on one side or the other? How do you think it disappeared altogether?
Well, so you're right to bring in Nemesius, and Harry A. Wolfson has an article that's another kind of classic must-read article on this, and he mentions Nemesius, and he goes much more into the history than I did. I mean, that's kind of the thumbnail sketch. In the book, I do talk more about the history, and so I do mention Nemesius is very important and all that. So as far as it, so remember, for Descartes still accepts three internal senses. So he does accept, so Suarez, for example, said there's just one internal sense. And just the imagination. Usually people would just say it's just the imagination. And then he views the other internal senses as all subfunctions of imagination. So Descartes was familiar with that. And yet he still, in a sense, he's more Aristotelian on this, because he accepts three internal senses: the common sense, imagination, and memory. So he accepts the Aristotelian triad, and he views that as having different brain centers. So they're still talking about the internal senses. Like Hume, all the moderns talk about the internal senses. The difference is how they conceive of them. So for Hobbes, he'll talk about your imagination and your memory, right? They're different. But they're all they are is, he's a materialist. So in a materialist setting, the internal senses become nothing but organs, or they become functions of organs, we should say, familiar with functionalism. So that's all they are, is a function of an organ. And then people will read that back into Aristotle, which in the book, I'm actually trying to do a lot of work to disagree with that as best I can. So if you're a materialist, they're just organs. And although Occam kind of makes a move in that way, because Occam says that do your two eyes have one power of vision, or do they have two? His answer is that each eye has its own power of vision. Each ear has its own power of hearing. Well, Thomas never says that. If anything, Thomas really doesn't say that. And so already with Occam, it's kind of like the soul's powers and the soul itself are just being subsumed back into the body. Like they're not, the sensory soul doesn't transcend the body. He says it's coextensive with the body. He says that if I cut off my finger, I lose a part of my sensory soul. So my sensory soul is like almost quantified in my body. So that if you cut off a piece of my body, you cut off a piece of my soul. Well, if you know Aristotle, that's not how it works. You lose your hand. Your hand is not soul anymore, but you don't lose part of your soul. So the way that Occam talks about the soul is, and the powers, is already kind of veering off into materialism. So they'll still have the language of the internal senses, and like Hobbes, but now they're just functions of powers, of organs. And then for Descartes, in a sense, it's the same thing, because the common sense, imagination, and memory, they're not powers of the mind, they're powers of the body. So they're just part of the machine, maybe kind of like the computer, they're like the computer side of us, and then our intellect is the spiritual side of us. So even though the language of internal senses remains in the moderns, it's whether you're whether you're a materialist or a dualist, they just become part of the body machine. And then with the postmoderns, I basically think of the first postmodern, like Nietzsche. At that point, he just completely gets rid of the power of the soul entirely, including the internal senses. So then in postmodernity, let's say, I think of 1831 as the endpoint of modernity, because that's when Hegel died. So anything after 1831, you could pretty safely call postmodern or contemporary philosophy. And they're getting rid of the powers of the soul entirely, as just, there are no powers of the soul at all. So it's really, that's why I guess it is still, you keep coming back to that problem of mechanistic materialism, because even Descartes, even though he's a dualist, as far as the body is concerned, he's a mechanist. And so that's such an, I would say, an impoverished anthropology. Yeah, anyway.
Well, thank you. Next up is going to be Franklin, Laura, Kevin, and Mark. Franklin.
Yes, thank you. Great topic, probably over my head, but I have the impression that there was something like the 8th Council of Constantinople when Pope Theodosius established the Aristotelian dualistic metaphysic as catechism, and in the process sidelined the soul, the imagination, that the imagination was no longer an essential part of a 3-part universe. And with that, we begin to lose the soul of the world, which is like we're like a little drop of the ocean of the soul of the world. We have the ocean in us, we're like the soul of the world, but we're only a piece of it. But with this dualistic metaphysic, the soul is lost or begins to fade away.
Okay, so you want me to comment on that, or?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
I wish you would. And does this ring any bells as Pope Theodosius and the Council of Constantinople? I don't know.
Unfortunately, it doesn't. Now the world soul does, so that's Platonic. And so certainly Plato and the Neoplatonists are going to have that. And I mean, Neoplatonism is all through the Middle Ages. That's a major trend. And if anything, Aristotelianism was in the minority. Some people will use the word dualism for Aristotle. So they'll say, well, because he says there's a soul and a body, there's a dualism there. I prefer to reserve it for Platonism, because the soul and body are one thing. So therefore they're one thing with two aspects. So I prefer to call it hylomorphism. And yeah, I mean, Aristotle doesn't really directly address the world soul anyplace. So I guess what I would say is that in terms of, he does say that the soul, the intellectual soul, comes from God in the book on generation of animals. I think it's book 2, chapter 1, thereabouts. But he does have a different perspective. The world soul makes me think more of Thales. I mean, a lot of my work has been from Thales up to Aristotle, and then Aquinas and the Arabs. But so for Aristotle, he has a kind of clearer picture of a transcendent divinity, whereas in Thales had said all things are full of gods, all things are full of soul. So I think that when Plato introduces the world soul in the Timaeus, I think he's kind of integrating or synthesizing that idea from Thales that everything has a soul, and certainly he's successful in that with the kind of use of the world soul. But that's definitely a major divide between Neoplatonism, Plato, and Aristotle and Aristotelian, those two traditions.
Thank you. Next up, Laura, what's your question? Laura, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I got it finally.
Go ahead.
This may be hitting at a pedestrian level of some degree, but you were talking about areas where these things lie. And I was thinking about how we often talk about people having either they're a artistic or logical thinkers, the areas of the brain where they reside. And so I started thinking about that with respect to what you're talking about. And is that the case? I mean, do we take it down to that level where we're either A or B? Or
Okay. So, I mean, is there anything else you wanted to add to that, or?
No, she's just asking whether, this distinction that many people think in terms of, okay, we are artistic versus scientific temperament. Do you have any comments about that?
So I guess, I mean, on some degree, each of us as thinkers, right? We're, I think we're the product of our influences. And so, I mean, I definitely am kind of, I hate to label myself, but it'd be hard to say that I'm not a Thomistic Aristotelian, because I think that would just be not accurate. But I did do my master's degree on Heidegger. So I spent a lot of time with an existentialist. So certainly Heidegger is trying to get away from an overemphasis on logic, because in the 20th century philosophy, you had this logical positivism. And so the current division of philosophy is you have analytic philosophy, which is extremely logical for the most part. And then you have continental philosophy, right, which is existentialist or postmodern, which is kind of basically the opposite. I mean, Heidegger never uses a syllogism. I mean, he'll quote a poet before he'll quote, a logician. So you have that kind of divide in 21st century philosophy that's as strong as ever. And every once in a while, there'll be a book about an article about that divide and how to try to bridge it. And that's this, like in 2021, that's the division within philosophy, where the analytics will say that the continentals aren't doing philosophy at all. And then the continentals think the same about the analytics. So it's I don't know if there's ever been quite that strong of a division amongst professional philosophers and just philosophy in general. So there are artistic versus logical thinkers. And I think the cogitative can apply to both, because as I said, if I want, like I've been speaking as an Aristotelian and Thomist here, I'm focusing on the logical aspect, I suppose. But Heidegger doesn't work that way. And my master's dissertation was called Heidegger's Criticism of Four Causes. But basically, the priest who helped me with this, because I was having a hard time with Heidegger, which if you read him, I think you'll be able to relate. And I said, what is he getting at here? And this priest said to me, well, he's rediscovering the internal senses. And that made a lot of sense, because like that's why I was talking about the concrete. So even though, the tendency might be to think, well, like, I know Mark Stallman's big fan of Marshall McLuhan. And McLuhan is more on the literary side of things, less on the logical side of things. And I think we have things to learn from both people, the logicians shouldn't dismiss people, the more literary types, and the literary types shouldn't dismiss the logicians, which is what naturally tends to happen. But certainly, the cogitative can apply in either case, because, I think you were quoting the Péguerre, the last paragraph of the Péguerre in one of the previous videos, where he brings that in, the kind of cogitative as applying to Strickland. You were reading that paragraph in one of the other videos, where Péguerre says, like, this is the faculty of artists, because artists are dealing with the concrete. So that's where there's a lot of interesting thought about the cogitative. And Thomas doesn't talk about that at all, right? Because really, Thomas doesn't have a lot to say about it. I mean, that's maybe another reason that I'm going to get the award for the world's slowest writer, because he has so little to say about it that I end up, my book ends up going into a lot of other things like anthropology, because he's quite terse about it. But so that would be the artistic aspect of the cogitative. The logical, he calls it particular reason. So he's certainly, that's obvious. I mean, right, that it applies in logic. But the artistic, I don't really know of no place comes to mind where he mentions that. So that'd be the kind of thing that there's still work to be done, and there's still thoughts to be had about, or conversations to be had about, that could bring in the cogitative. So the artistic one would be one of those conversations.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Mark, and then we're going to do breakout rooms for 20 minutes so we can talk about these ideas amongst ourselves, and then we'll come back to talk about our takeaways. Kevin, what's your question?
Yes, thank you. I understand dualism is one coin of two sides. They coexist. One side is soul, another side is the body. So my question is, can dualism be compared to yin and yang? Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I don't know much about the Oriental tradition, the Eastern tradition, but I do know. I mean, I've read the Tao Te Ching. You know, that's not doesn't, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in it. It's actually very similar. The Yin and Yang and the Tao Te Ching is actually similar to some of the pre-Socratics. It was written about the same time. If any of you have heard of the axial age, which I forget, Ernst Cassirer. Introduced the idea of an axial age, how it's fascinating how at the same time that Greek philosophy was developing, you had Buddhism in India and you had the Tao Te Ching in China. So it is, I think that's a valuable idea, how there was this great kind of leap forward simultaneously. Although there was some cross-fertilization there, and there's a book on that. I mean, I'm always buying books. I mean, I'm not saying I agree with Beckwith, but he's a skeptic, but he has a book called The Greek Buddha, where he actually talks about how the Greek skeptics, because Alexander the Great had gone to India, they met some of these Indian philosophers who were skeptics. So there's actually is a direct connection with Eastern and Western skepticism, where Western skepticism goes back. So certainly in the East, you do have a lot of skepticism with Buddhism. And I think, right, there can be more of a dualism. And that's where I think Aristotle has a lot to offer to the East as well. And of course, they have their own beautiful culture and traditions. But I think it was Mark Stallman who might have told me that they were translating Thomas's Summa. They translated the Summa into Chinese for the first time. So that's all one would hope that, you know, Thomas would catch on in China, but anyway.
Next up is Mark. Mark, go ahead. Yes.
Mark Barker is correct. The Chinese have gone crazy over the classics, East and West. 5 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, they began teaching all of their top cadres in the Central Party School in Beijing the Chinese classics. They had actually gone to the University of Chicago and met with the people who were teaching great books to try to get some ideas about how to teach that. I have actually met professors at PKU, Beijing University. One of their jobs is to teach the Politburo, which is the equivalent of the Senate, and the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which is the equivalent of the cabinet. They are being taught, these are obviously older people, lived through a Mao era where none of this was talked about. They're being taught I Ching all the way up to the top. But in addition to that, my understanding is that all across China, classics departments, Western classics departments are opening up. And so this recent translation, there may have been earlier translations, but indeed, there's a new complete translation from the ground up of Aristotle, and I presume others, that is working its way into this. So that the Chinese fascination with these topics, East and West, is quite remarkable. Just imagine a situation where you could not be elected a senator in the United States if you hadn't passed the test on Aristotle.
Wonderful.
My question for you, though, Mark, is so we're in agreement of the importance of these relationships amongst these senses. And as is often the case when something interesting and elaborate and historical presented like this, the question becomes, well, that's wonderful. What could go wrong? And so I'm wondering if in your book or in your other readings, you've run across people who focused on that subject. So once we have an architecture of the sort that you're describing here, there's a number of ways that that could break down. And in particular, it is the view, as you know, the center. The television completely overemphasizes the imaginary part of this, eliminating any memorative components of this. So you wind up with a population that is more or less running on fantasy. And whether non-fungible tokens count as an example, whether invading the Capitol on January the 6th counts as an example, but there's a lot of wacky things going on, fantasy type things going on. So, and as you know, it's our view that digital technology, because of the architecture of digital technology, inherently shifts the balance of the inner senses from fantasy to memory. And I'm not saying that either of those are categorically good or bad, but it does seem to us, at least, that the what could go wrong is now in some sort of transition. And so I'm curious, as a scholar of all of this, would Aristotle have ever imagined that we would sit down for hours a day watching a blinking light puppet show? Or might he have said, because his teacher, Plato, had his teacher, Socrates, I believe, murdered for his opposition to the Eleusinian mysteries. And you wind up in the Republic with the parable of the cave, which is clearly, in Greek terms, that there was no other festival where people sat around watching a blazing fire. That's the Eleusinian mysteries. And Socrates is the guy who escapes and then is murdered from all of that. I'm just wondering if given that what we have are Aristotle's class notes, and he didn't sit down and write a extensive treatment of all of these things, but did anybody, did Occam or anybody else who you studied, did they try to list out how this whole thing could go sideways? How this arrangement that we have here could wind up with some really serious problems?
Right. So that's a good question. There's a tradition, I think it's a Dominican tradition. I'm not sure where else it would be from, but that's you need a dead master and a living master. So Aristotle and Aquinas are dead masters, right? We can read their writings, but they can't explain them to us, and we can't ask them how to make sense of television or the information revolution or the industrial revolution or the stirrup. I mean, there's so much that's happened since then, Aristotle. So like we were saying at the beginning, the beauty is that what they say about human nature is still, I think, as valid as it was today as it was back then. And that's why we should look at it. But it is up to us to make those applications development. So I'm glad that, you all are doing that, because that's what we need to do, because I totally agree with the Thomas doesn't talk about it, but 20th century Thomas will talk about the judgment of existence, existential judgment, and that's one thing I've been working on, and I need to write something about at some point, maybe 30 years from now. But the existential judgment is missing in just when I'm sitting in front of a screen all day. So we have a realist epistemology, and so. Right, you're right to bring in the cave allegory, that in a sense, we're like those people trapped in a cave staring at a screen. Like it's kind of prophetic. There's these strange prophetic things in Plato. Remember, Plato says in the Republic, he says, well, if someone were to be really, really good, if someone would be the most just person, they would capture him and crucify him. Well, he wrote that in 400 BC or 380 BC. And so some of the fathers of the church said that there's a kind of prophetic quality to Plato. And I mean, with that, speaking as a philosopher, right, regarding the cave allegory, if nothing else, there's something so brilliant about these Greek philosophers that they're still perennial applications of their ideas. So yes, and Aristotle and Thomas are realists. So I mean, their epistemology is that, see, in a sense, it is that we're encountering reality. For the moderns, I can't get past the veil of perception. So for the moderns, they're called, Richard Rorty's term is representationalist. So everything I experience for Kant or for Descartes, for Kant, everything I experience is all just like, it is like a TV screen. I can never get behind the screen. So in some sense, the technology has taken Kant's error and made it reality. And then we have, I think, a huge, political, social, etc. crisis on some level because of that. And I agree about the non-fungible tokens thing. I've come across that, and I guess it's just the logic of modernity playing itself out, where reality doesn't matter anymore and everything becomes digital. And we don't want to be Luddites and just reject technology out of hand. Like right now, we're meeting on Zoom, which we couldn't do. But the problem is, right? McLuhan was right about that. That it ends up having effects that people aren't aware of. And I think the last year we've seen that in a lot of ways. So, as far as what is going wrong, yeah, and that's where it's up to us to make those applications, because there's nothing like that in Thomas and Aristotle, really. I mean, that kind of analysis that we could provide in the 21st century. So.
Wonderful. So folks, now it's time to discuss these ideas in small groups for 20 minutes. And then we'll come back here to talk about our takeaways, and maybe we'll have a little bit of time for the questions. All right, it's time for takeaways and questions, further questions. Let's try to keep it brief so we can get to as many as possible. Again, the same rules. Type exclamation mark to provide your takeaway or a question. That's number one. Number two, keep on topic. Number three, be brief. Number four, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anything on any, with anybody, and do so courteously. Barry, what's your takeaway or question? Barry, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, there you go. My takeaway was, when I was a teenager, I was into science fiction. I read a book by A.E. Van Vogt, and it was called The World of Null A. Anybody familiar with that book?
Barry, you need to be brief. We have the next pickup is coming up soon. Go ahead.
So, yeah, I'm being brief. And so the question I have is the world of Null A mechanistic world where you see humans as machines? And I guess the other thing I have a question of is there is a book written by Edith Hall called The Aristotle Way. Are you familiar with that book? And it treats Aristotle philosophy as a self-improvement philosophy. And if you would comment on that, I would be real interested.
Okay. So yeah, the first book, unfortunately, I haven't heard of that book, so I can't really speak to that. As far as the other book, yeah, I think that's right, that self-improvement is a good way to describe his worldview. And so, I mean, that gets a bit more into his ethics. And here we were focused on his kind of philosophical psychology and the way it developed. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would agree, but since I don't know the book, I guess I can't say too much beyond that.
Okay, next up is Donna.
So in our breakout room, we started this question about artificial intelligence, and ethics comes into question. I'm curious to know, it's going to be wild to see, what do we do with self-driving cars and the trolley experiment? Who's going to die and who's going to live? I mean, that's going to be the real challenge. We haven't even gotten to the challenges of artificial intelligence. It really will be quite wild.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point, right? The famous trolley, if it's headed for 5 people, do you put it on the track to kill the 2 people who are also it's going to kill? That's kind of the utilitarian way. I mean, I guess, yeah, I think that at first I was a skeptic about self-driving cars, and then I just saw that Chipotle, on the internet, Chipotle said that there's it's called NU, the new car, and it showed it driving around. I actually have a friend who is working on that technology, and he was asking about it. He was asking me if the Cogitative had something to offer, because he's aware, right, the pattern recognition idea, and he was asking me to help him. And I guess, yeah, that's programming, and I guess that's the order of efficiency, right? Like, we have such an efficient world, and it seems to me sometimes, right, like our world is going nowhere fast. Like, we've lost, what is the meaning of life, right? Aristotle tells us what the meaning of life is, right? We want to be virtuous. He says that God is the one, everything came from God, and that basically we should try to serve God. But the moderns don't have a clear vision of that. So, I mean, the danger is, with all this technology, we're able to process so much information, share so much information, but the quality of the information is what really matters, and having wisdom. And so I think both Aristotle and Aquinas have a special place in that, with regards to that. So even as I guess there's a distinction you can make between the order of efficiency and the order of fecundity. So as the order of efficiency increases, and this goes back really to Francis Bacon, who in about the year 1600 is saying, well, he's saying we need to get rid of all this Aristotle stuff of there being purposes in nature. There's no purpose to nature. There's no forms in nature. There's just matter. And that's the modern world view of nature, right? As nature is just atoms. It's just, there's no purposes in it. Whereas for Aristotle, each kind of animal had its own purpose. Each organ had its own purpose, which I think is self-evidently true or obviously true on some level. And then what ethics flows from that? How should we live our lives based on that? So, yeah, I guess I'm glad that there's people other than, just a couple of scholars talking about the cogitative, because, if we want to get back to holomorphism, that kind of sophisticated holomorphism that people just won't dismiss, the cogitative does have a role to play there in a complete recovery or retrieval of holomorphism, not just meaning kind of holomorphism at its best in some ways, which includes Thomas, because Pico della Mirandola, you might have heard of him. He wrote The Oration on the Dignity of Man. He's another Renaissance philosopher. And he himself was more of a Neoplatonist. We talked about the world soul. He was more of a Neoplatonist, but he did say that sine Thoma Aristoteles mutus esset, which means without Thomas, Aristotle would be mute. So he was a kind of another genius. He died very young. I think there is evidence that he was poisoned. But even he, who was not even really an Aristotelian per se, he said that you need Aquinas to help you understand Aristotle. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. So hopefully we can, help spread some of that return to realism and Aristotelian ethics. So.
Thank you. Folks, if you want to share your takeaways or ask questions, you can go ahead and type ! Next up is Mark Stallman.
Thank you, Shrikant. This is fascinating that a friend of yours is working on self-driving cars and had the presence of mind to recognize that the cogitative power implied pattern recognition?
Well, remember, this is someone who I taught for several years, so he's gonna know about that, and yeah, I mean, he didn't use the language pattern recognition. I'm getting that more from you, Mark, that precise terminology. But he was explaining to me how he was saying how the computer program has a very hard time telling one thing from another, and he's trying to write a computer program and he was like, they're having a really hard time. And he was saying, well, you work on the cogitative, right? How can you help me with that? And I was just saying, well, not really, because I mean, I guess I've never thought about it from that angle. And ultimately, I'm more interested in ethics. I feel like the order of efficiency, we're like, the problem is sometimes I feel like we have space age technology and Stone Age philosophy in our society. That would be a simple way to put it.
That's a beautifully put. I love that.
Right.
Just to add a little bit to this, it turns out that the current field of artificial intelligence is focused on the problem that they describe as the common sense. That is the big holy grail today for artificial intelligence, recognizing that a 3-year-old child knows whether an elephant can fit through a door or not, but an AI does not.
Right. That's what he said too about, he said, how do they tell that there's a drunk pedestrian? Because most pedestrians are not a threat, but a drunk pedestrian could, be a threat, a threat of there being an accident. And so he says, how do we teach it that that's a drunk pedestrian as opposed to one that's not? And right, as a human, I mean, there's all kinds of cues that I would rely on for that. I mean, and so exactly, yeah.
So my point here is just that AI is struggling with what they are calling common sense, but they, of course, haven't got an elaborated understanding of the inner senses. So the problem they're actually dealing with is cogitative power here, without knowing that's what they're dealing with. But there's tens of millions of dollars being spent at the Allen Institute in Seattle and others trying to solve the common sense problem here. And just in case I don't speak again, for those who here may have some interest or understanding of in particular, Chinese approach to all of this, I have had an opportunity to speak with the president of the university in Beijing, whose goal is to try to train an AI to do the I Ching. The I Ching is a very sophisticated cogitative power test. He doesn't have the language, he doesn't know what the arrangement is here, but I'm quite confident, inevitably, in the next 5+ years, we will hear about people trying to build artificial souls. And in the process, they will be coming to Mark Barker and others to try to figure out what a natural soul is like. We're inevitably heading in that direction. At the same time, the other side of that coin, if you will, is the human beings finally coming to recognize that this whole robotic exercise really has to be brought under control. And building artificial souls may be the tripping point on that.
Thank you, Mark. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Peter. Kevin.
Yes, I try to be quick. We just mentioned dualism. What's the current problem? We use monism or binarism. It's kind of, we lost the word binarism. We maybe even have a negative meaning. What's the problem, like a current thinking society? Thank you.
I don't know whether I got the terms, or what two things are you talking about, Kevin?
Monism.
Monism?
Yeah, and binarism.
Okay.
We'll talk about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so, well, it's fine. That's just basic terminology. So I mentioned Thales, right? Thales, the first philosopher / scientist in the Western world, that's where it begins. I mean, there could have been people before him, but that's where it begins as far as we know, about 585 BC. And he was a monist. So the question of, what is everything made of? He just says everything is water. So he takes there's 4 elements and he picks one. He says it must all be water. So it's a starting point, right? At least he's asking the question why, like, and what the why and what questions of philosophy and to some degree science. So he's a monist because everything is one thing. Everything is just water. And even the soul is water. And if there's gods, they're water. So that's monism. And then we don't use the word binaryism. We would use the word dualism. So monism is that everything is one thing. Dualism is everything is two things. So normally spirit and matter, like Plato. And then you'd have pluralism. So pluralism is everything is more than two things. So in terms of pre-Socratics, that would be Empedocles, who said that all 4 elements are ultimate. So that's how that would apply in terms of philosophy of nature. So yeah, anyway.
Well, Peter.
Hi, yes, thank you. So just first quick comment on the drunk pedestrian. How do you know it's drunk? My guess is that Google's robots with reCAPTCHA, every time that you try and log in, instead of clicking what's a crosswalk, you might find, is this a drunk person? Check all the drunk people. So I look forward to that in the coming months. But no, I just my takeaway, I don't necessarily have a question, is I just want to say, since we were in the breakout room together in this to the group, I'm just absolutely blown away that you got to this topic, not just of the interior senses and their importance, but of particularly St. Thomas's understanding of the cogitative power. How you got to that from a question about Heidegger's attempt to make any of this clear, and that your priest mentor helped you get to that point. I thought that's amazing. And something I just want to repeat here is that I mentioned in the breakout room is I think who knows what sparks will fly when that question is asked about Romano Guardini, who was Heidegger's senior peer at Freiburg and actually did become a priest, unlike Heidegger, who abandoned his theology training. What happens when the inner senses are brought to bear on Guardini's thought, which has not even begun to be discussed in English? So thanks again to you, Dr. Mark Barker, and to Shrikant again. So thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So Mark, I think this was very remarkable. Okay, this is, so firstly, I mean, not just, so one part of it is just your scholarship, which is incredible, being able to show very clearly, Aristotle, the Arabic philosophers, and Aquinas to present day, with kind of the obstacles in between, you were able to do that. Secondly, you were actually able to communicate that in a fairly clear term to pretty much anybody who wants to know. Okay, so I am now, I want your book out soon, and I don't think the world needs to wait for your book out, because what you already have, both in terms of knowledge and ability to communicate, it is at a level where today, for example, this video that people are watching, people can get the essence of it. And maybe we can do more of these to get the word out, which will not only help help the world, but it will also help your book whenever it comes out. So I don't want to push you on the book, but I would love to have you talk, more about this, because this is something which is really critical to.
And that's kind of why I did it, because I'm usually very research oriented, as you probably are able to see. But I've just found myself listening to things on YouTube lately. I guess like you were talking about NFTs and technology, I try to keep up on that a little bit, and I'll just listen to it. I don't even necessarily have to watch it. So I realized like so much of there's really an oral culture now. It's kind of funny because we're such a written culture, where knowledge was really via the written word so much. But I think so many people now with podcasts and things, they'll just maybe they don't have any time to look at a book at all. But maybe when they're driving to work, they'll listen. So maybe if someone hears about the Cogitative Power and they YouTube it, and they could listen to this when they're driving to work, so that's why I thought, let's get some of this out. I wanted to cooperate in getting some of this out there in an oral spoken form. So that's why I did it.
Wonderful.
Because usually I'm pretty strict about just keeping research oriented, because that's the nature of my work. But so I agree. And I appreciate the opportunity and the conversation.
Yeah, no, the other thing I would say is that one remarkable thing I noticed, that the way you answered questions, the way you commented on things, even when you did not know much about things, you were able to kind of give people historical context so that they could use that to figure it out. So I think you're able to not only, stuff, you're able to communicate as a presenter, but also able to interact with people where they are and relate the knowledge that you have, which is actually from a long time ago, to what they are thinking. So these are tremendous assets, Mark. So thank you very much. Tremendous. It was just incredible honor, as well as just sheer delight. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot.